Medieval kings were not the only rulers determined to expand their authority. Beginning around the year 1000, the popes of Rome also sought to increase their power, both within the Church and over the secular governments of Europe. As the papacy grew more ambitious and assertive, it became one of the most dangerous rivals that European kings would face. The confrontation between these two powers reached its most dramatic form in the conflict historians call the investiture struggle. To understand how and why this struggle emerged, it is necessary to look first at the nature of the papacy between roughly 400 and 1000. By late antiquity, popes claimed leadership of the Western Christian Church through what became known as the Petrine Theory. According to this belief, St. Peter had been chosen by Christ as the leader of the apostles, and the bishops of Rome were Peter's direct successors. On this basis, popes argued that they possessed supreme authority over Western Christianity. By the 6th century, most Western Christians accepted this claim in theory. In practice, however, the pope did not actually govern the Church. Throughout the early Middle Ages, papal authority remained largely spiritual rather than administrative. Individual bishops ruled their own dioceses with little interference from Rome, and secular rulers often exercised significant influence over who became bishop. Kings and nobles routinely nominated or controlled episcopal elections, treating church offices as extensions of their political power. The pope, lacking effective administrative structures or enforcement mechanisms, could do little to stop this. Even the papacy itself was subject to secular domination. Before the 10th century, powerful Roman noble families largely controlled papal elections, frequently turning the papacy into a local political prize. Later, after Emperor Otto I brought Rome under the authority of the Holy Roman Empire, German emperors effectively controlled papal elections for decades. If the Pope wished to rule the Church in more than name alone, secular control over church offices and over the papacy itself had to be eliminated. Around the year 1000, a widespread movement for reform began to take shape. The most influential force behind this effort was the Cluniac reform movement, led by monks from the monastery of Cluny in southern France. These reformers sought to free the Church from worldly control, restore spiritual discipline, and strengthen the authority of the papacy. Monks were seen as especially credible leaders of reform because they had renounced wealth, sexual relationships, and inheritance, distancing themselves from the corruption that plagued much of the clergy. At first, German kings, who were also Holy Roman emperors, supported these reforms. They believed that, like the emperors of ancient Rome, it was their duty to protect and guide the Church. In fact, they assisted in the election of reform-minded popes, and expected those popes to cooperate with imperial authority. Yet reform soon took a direction that emperors had not anticipated. Once the Church began to free itself from lay control, it no longer wished to remain subordinate to secular rulers. A critical turning point came in 1059, when Pope Nicholas II reformed the papal election process. From that moment on, the Pope would be chosen by the cardinals, the senior clergy of Rome. Although the emperor retained a right of approval, this privilege had to be renewed with each reign. As relations between popes and emperors deteriorated, the papacy simply refused to renew that right. For the first time, the Church had secured a measure of independence at its highest level, opening the door to much more radical reform. The next and most aggressive phase of reform was led by Pope Gregory VII, who reigned from 1073 to 1085. Gregory was one of the most determined and uncompromising popes in medieval history. He sought to eliminate all secular interference in church affairs, to end lay control over church appointments, and to bring bishops firmly under papal authority. At the heart of this program was the issue of investiture, the formal appointment and ceremonial installation of bishops and archbishops. Traditionally, kings and powerful nobles selected bishops and invested them with the symbols of their office. These bishops were not merely religious figures, they were vital administrators, judges, and loyal vassals. This was especially true in the Holy Roman Empire, where emperors relied heavily on bishops and abbots to govern. Gregory VII declared that only church officials had the right to invest bishops. By challenging this long-standing practice, the Pope directly threatened the political foundations of secular rule. Conflict was unavoidable. The most dramatic clash occurred between Gregory and Henry IV, King of Germany and Holy Roman Emperor. In 1065, Henry appointed his own candidate as Archbishop of Milan, openly violating Gregory's decrees. The Pope responded by excommunicating Henry, cutting him off from the church. This was no symbolic gesture. An excommunicated king risked losing the loyalty of his nobles, who could legally rebel against a ruler condemned by the church. Henry's entire claim to legitimacy now stood in jeopardy. Faced with rebellion at home and the possible collapse of his authority, Henry sought reconciliation. In the winter of 1076-1077, he crossed the Alps in harsh conditions to meet the Pope, who was staying at the fortress of Canossa in northern Italy. According to contemporary chroniclers, Henry arrived dressed as a penitent. For 3 days he was denied entry, standing barefoot in the snow, fasting and pleading for forgiveness. On January 28, 1077, the feast of the conversion of St. Paul, Gregory finally admitted him. Henry knelt before the Pope and begged absolution. Gregory lifted the excommunication, and the two men shared communion that evening. The image of an emperor humbling himself before a pope became one of the most powerful symbols of the Middle Ages. Although the struggle over investiture would continue for decades under later popes and emperors, the events at Canossa marked a decisive turning point. They demonstrated that the Pope possessed the moral authority to challenge even the strongest rulers of Europe. The investiture struggle permanently altered the balance between church and state, reshaping medieval politics and elevating the papacy into a central political force in European history.